we begin week one, we need to set a good foundation for the whole class. We're discussing church planting as an evangelistic method or strategy, but we need to lay some foundations from the very beginning to kind of help us understand and build on the rest of the course. And so this particular lecture is going to discuss going from a vision to a movement. And we're going to look at the phases of planting a new church. Now, you'll see that the word envision is there in the front. Now, I'll be explaining that in a little bit, and you'll notice in your syllabus that there are 5 kind of phases that we outlined. They even outline the assignment. So we're going to actually explain that today, the 5 phases of church planting. And so we're going to discuss what it means to go from a vision to a movement. So the question for this week is, what is God's vision for me in church planting? What is God's idea for church planting? What is His mind for it? What should our vision for church planting be? I can go on for a little while and tell of my personal story of what I had my own personal vision for church planting, and it was a very Dustin-centered idea. And yes, it involved a really cool church that all the Christians in the community would want to come to. And I would have had a big stage, laser show, lights, smoke rising. Would have had one of those holes cut out in the stage. And I would have risen as I was getting ready to do the sermon. That was my initial idea years ago. God has thankfully redeemed that and shaped my thinking a lot. And so we want to look at today, what is God's vision for me in church planting? And to begin answering that question, I want us to look at the 5 phases of church planting. Because in order to see you have a vision, in order to see it come to fruition, you need to have a plan. And so we're going to kind of walk through what that would look like today. So we're going from a vision, let's plant a church, a great idea, to a movement. Our church has multiplied many churches. So it goes from planting a single church to what does a movement look like over the lifetime of your church. So there's different ways of kind of describing the phases or stages of church planting, and if you study different missiologists, it seems like they all have their own. And we're going to look at a couple samples today, and then what I've done is I've kind of made my own. I've joined the group, but I've made my own that basically just kind of summarizes several of the really good ones out there. And so the first one is one called the Pauline Cycle of Missions, and this comes from the Book of Acts, which you are journaling in this class. But here are the 10. This is the cycle. We see that Paul does this over and over again. First of all, missionaries are commissioned; they're sent out. There's an audience that is contacted, where there's in Thessalonica or it was in Ephesus, wherever it was, they were contacted in some way. They went to the synagogue and they communicated the gospel in a culturally, contextually appropriate way. They were communicating the core idea of Jesus Christ and Him crucified and risen. Hearers were converted. People were believing. Believers were congregated. They were gathering together. Their faith was confirmed. Leadership was consecrated and developed. The believers were commended for the good work they were doing and admonished to keep going and grow in their discipleship. Relationships were continued, and then sending churches convened. They got together and said, how can we keep doing this? How can we do it better? So we see that cycle happen throughout Paul's life. He had 3 missionary journeys, and along those journeys, this is essentially what was happening in each of these cities. And so this is kind of the standard in missiology to look at the Pauline cycle of missions, but there's several other good ones. Often when you look at church planting phases or the stages of church planting, there's 2 analogies that are the most often used, it seems like, and there's a human growth type analogy and a plant growth analogy. So the human growth, you'll hear a church plant say, well, I'm in the conception phase. And I'm not going to the biological sense of that, but the idea is we have an idea that's planted in our minds, right? An idea of a new church. Then you get to the prenatal phase. You're preparing, you're getting things ready. Then you're in the birth infancy stage. Birth means something new is here. A new church has now started. But then you're in the infancy stage. You're figuring out what it means to walk and talk and do things as a young church. And so adolescence is kind of the young phase where figuring out out what identity and mission is, and then it goes into the adulthood or the reproduction phase. It's time to start thinking of how can we reproduce, and so that's the first analogy, the human growth. The second is a plant growth, and it really mirrors, it's just other words. And so you'll hear planters say, "Well, I'm planting a seed. The idea, a seed has been implanted in my mind of what this new church could be, and there's a need for it on this side of town or in this particular community." Then you talk about germination that's in the ground and it's starting to develop underneath the soil, but you can't see anything yet. Right. Then it sprouts and it becomes something. So the plant pokes out of the ground and it's there, right? But it's still very small, so there's a growth and maturity. But then it releases seeds as any healthy plant. If it's in the right conditions, good soil and water and so forth, it should reproduce. Every healthy plant should reproduce, and so that's the purpose of bearing fruit and seeds, and that the plant seeds fall and more grow. So that's the idea. So you see, these are basically the same exact thing, just using a human growth or plant. Now, I find it a little bit comical when you talk to a church planter and they say, "Oh, I'm in the prenatal phase." And you're thinking, okay, that's interesting. And then it really gets odd when they talk about the conception phase. But they also say, we're birthing a new church. Very, very common phrase. So those are two analogies that you kind of see more often in the descriptions of the church planting phases. And you'll hear some of these come out even throughout the rest of this course. Here's one that comes from the Global Church Advancement website and book. 7 seasons of church planting and multiplication. And so the 7 seasons are basically phases. So there's a preparing phase, a gathering phase, a developing phase, a mentoring phase, a growing phase, a locating phase, and a multiplying phase. And so you can see, I'm not going to go through all those, but this is a really good list that I will share with you. Make sure that you have a PDF version of this. This is just really good list of the various things. You see the people that are involved, the church planter, the coach, the launch team, the core group, the new leaders, the elders, deacons, and so forth, all the way through. You are now have a church planting movement happening, the people who are leading that. It also looks at the processes, confirming the church planter's vision and calling, developing a philosophy and model, and then going into implementing an evangelism, developing authentic community and understanding lay gifts. Then you're mentoring these new leaders. Then you help them. You're establishing goals for growing in your church, and you're leading the church and organizing itself healthily. And then locating phase, you're determining where, when you need to meet. You're overseeing what that looks like. And then the multiplying phase, you're saying, okay, we now want to start a second church. We want to start a third or fourth and fifth and so forth. So this is really good because it even gives a timeline there at the bottom. 6 to 12 months for the first, and 6 to 12, 1 to 2. And so you see that this is actually really, really healthy, and I've gleaned a lot from this list, and you'll see a lot of this come out in the rest of the class as well. So that's another one. It's called the 7 Seasons of Church Planting. It's a very, very good, very detailed list there. I had a professor at Southeastern Seminary who he was a church planter and missionary in Pakistan, and then did some work in Ecuador. And he basically came up with this very simple way, and he had hand gestures. And I can't remember the hand gestures for all of them, but he was teaching Muslim background new believers on how to plant churches. And so he said this is how he would just simply explain to them how you would do. So you, as you have a heart for these things, you have a heart and a passion to see this happen. You first of all pray, and then you evangelize, share the gospel. You make disciples. You start mentoring and teaching the new believers how to understand the Bible, what prayer is like. Then you start to gather them together. Small group Bible study. It depends on where. In his context, they were mostly house churches. But you start gathering together on a regular basis in some form and at some number. Then you're developing leaders. They're progressing so that they can even take over some of the ministries that you as a planter had been doing. Now they're taking over. And then you multiply. You're teaching them to go and do the exact same. And as you multiply, they go pray, evangelize, make disciples, gather, who do the same thing. So the cycle continues. And so I thought this was a really good, simple way in hand motion. Pray, I think, evangelize, make disciples, gather together, develop leaders, I think, and then, anyways, I can't remember the hand motions. I'm not going to try. So there were hand motions, almost like a song. This is Larry Klaus's 8 Steps to Plant a Church. Now, Mr. Klaus is actually a good friend of Piedmont. He speaks in chapel about every year. Good friend of our president, Dr. Pettit, and he actually did this in chapel about 2 years ago. And I jotted these down and thought they were really, really good and helpful. And so here is his eight very simple steps to plant a church. You make friends, and especially if you're moving to a new area, a new location. You make friends. You lead them to Christ. You disciple them, gather those disciples for a Bible study, move that Bible study to a Sunday morning, and start to grow it. Teach them to do the work of the ministry so that they own it. Organize the church, name, bylaws, location, all those type of things. Organize the church, and then reproduce. Go back through it again. So this is his very simple 8 steps to planting a church, which, as you see, ends in reproduction. Have you noticed that so far all of them have had something about multiplication and reproduction? That's key. You'll see that in a second. And you'll hear the word multiply and reproduce a lot in this class. So this is basically a little bit of a summary of the ones we just looked at. And so here you see the ones that we looked at in this kind of light gray, but over there on the far right where you see the yellow. For this class, I've kind of summarized, and this, see how they all fit. So there's an envisioning phase where missionaries are commissioned. They're sent out. It's the conception phase. It's an idea. It's a seed is planted in my mind type phase. It's the praying phase, and it's the making friends. That's the envisioning time. And then there's a preparing time. You're just preparing in general. That's in Pauline's cycle. It was the audience was contacted, the gospel was communicated, and hearers were converted. The human analogy is the prenatal development phase, and the plant analogy, the germination. Dr. Robinson's is when you evangelize and disciple, you're preparing them, and then Klaus's is when you're leading people to Christ and you're discipling them. So you see how this goes on through, and so I don't want to go through all of them, but our 5 phases that we're going to focus on is envision, prepare, launch, establish, repeat. So know those 4 tests. They will pop up. You will see this a lot. The class is actually outlined by these phases. So, and all your projects actually fit into this. You'll be walking through these phases and building your prospectus project that we mentioned in the syllabus. You actually be walking through these 5 phases, answering a ton of questions for all those, putting that together, and then developing an actual plan for a church plan. You can see this even fits. I tried to kind of show how graphically it even fits with Dr. Robinson's envisioning, praying, preparing is evangelize and make disciples. Launching is the gathering together. And launch can be starting a lot of church planting books and ideas. Launch is usually the first public Sunday morning worship gathering is what we call launch day. But if you're a house church planter, you're not really launching a big public worship service, but you're starting something. You're saying, okay, we're going to start having a Bible study. Okay, you're launching something as that follows your envisioning, you're preparing. And then you're establishing new leaders, you're establishing systems and structure, your programs and different things, and then you're repeating, you're fostering a multiplication mindset and doing it again. So here's a graphic that you want to see a lot in this class. This is the one I put together, and you see how everything, you go from envisioning, preparing, launching, establishing, and repeating is always at the center because we're always doing these things in order to multiply more churches. And so you can go through the phase one time in order to establish one new church, and then the idea is that you progress and do it again. Now, this is a kind of an updated version of my graphic. You'll hear in the class that I really love overlapping circles. Don't know why. Anytime I hit a whiteboard or try to explain something, I usually end up drawing circles that overlap in some way, whether it's a theological point, a missiological idea, whatever it is. So, because the reality is, as you're going through these 5 phases, there's different times for each of these. The envisioning phase, maybe a year or 2, 6 months. The preparing phase, maybe 6 months, maybe a year. The launching phase includes some pre-launch type things and some post-launch follow-up. It may be 3 to 6 months. The establishing phase, that's going to be several years even. And then the repeating phase is something that always happens. So the idea is that as you're envisioning things, you're still kind of have this idea in your mind. You're thinking through, where is God leading me to plant? How will we do it? Do I have a solid foundation biblically to do this? Do I have the backing of my church, the support of my spouse, different things? But as you're kind of finishing up some of those envisioning, you're going ahead and start preparing. And then as you're finishing some of the preparing, you're going ahead and getting ready for a launch. And as you're launching, you're already establishing a lot of things. So it's not a hard stop for each. You don't envision, and then after 6 months of envisioning, you stop on January 31st, and February 1st, you start preparing, and then you do that and so forth. It's really not a cut and dry. It's very much of an overlapping, but there are the general phase. You will progress through these. So me personally, right now, it's early January as I'm recording this video, January 2017, and I am actually in my closet recording this video lecture because we are in a transitional apartment. We've sold our home and sold a car. We're getting moved to move 2,700 miles away to Calgary, Alberta, Canada, to plant churches. It's a very lost city. 95% of people in Calgary do not know Jesus and who He is, what He's done for them. And so we're going with the North American Mission Board, and we have a sending church, Calvary Baptist, here in Winston-Salem. And so about a year and a half ago, God started bringing Calgary to our attention, and we started exploring it. And then we have been going through these phases. So we are right now at the end of the envisioning and starting the preparing phase, because we are getting ready to move. And once we move, we'll be sharing the gospel, we'll be evangelizing, we'll be discipling new believers, we'll be building relationships in community and different things, and then we'll be progressing through these phases. So even over the course of this semester, the 4 months or so that we'll be getting together, I'll try to keep updating you on what God is doing in our family, in our life. And you kind of can track. But for this church planting effort in Calgary, we are right now finishing up the envisioning phase, and it's been about a 15-16 month time frame for this envisioning. But we also have been doing a good bit of preparing. Part of our preparation was selling our previous house, selling a vehicle, my wife's job transitioning so that we could move, me leaving my job and starting a 6-month internship at the church, doing partnership development. So we were starting to prepare already as we're finishing up. So we're kind of in that middle area there between envisioning and preparing. And then we'll be moving towards a launch phase closer to next fall, with a launch date of hopefully sometime spring of 2018. But then we'll be establishing, after that, we'll be establishing ourselves as a new church, practicing the ordinances, delegating roles, selecting elders and deacons and different things, with a goal towards multiplication. So we're in this phase, but as you see, the goal is that as you get to the repeat phase, you actually start envisioning again. That's why they overlap. You get to the repeat phase, okay, it's time for our church to start another. And so you begin envisioning as a church, not just as an individual now, but you have now led your congregation, however old it is at this point, to start envisioning, okay, what does God want our church to do? Where should we do this? And then you're going to start preparing, and you're going to raise up a new leader to go and take this. So the idea is you repeat and you keep going. I could have kept making little circle lines there and keep going after repeat, but I didn't want to go. You get the general idea, is that they kind of overlap and they progress. So here's the idea. We want to go from a vision to a movement. And I think working through these phases kind of helps structure that really well, so that we can see here you see the large, the original church here in the middle says we want to plant a church, and so then they go out and they plant 3 churches over the course of their existence. And that's great. That they have planted 3 churches. Let's say this is a 10-year time frame. That's great. They have planted 3 churches in the last 10 years. That's something we actually be very proud of. Many churches are not involved in church planting at all in any way. And so here we see, but this one church cannot plant as many churches as their area needs. No one church can. No one church in the U.S. or even Canada can plant enough churches for all those. And so here the idea is you plant these churches, but you build in a multiplication mindset, and you have coached these new planters who you have sent out to work through the phase as well. And then they're able to then multiply. And here we even see that these 2 churches met in the middle and helped start a new church together. And so then they do the same thing, and we see that now from the one church there in the middle, all these other churches have now been planted because it set in a plan and a strategy and a vision that was based on multiplication. That's how we go from a vision to a movement. So we often say, is your vision as big as your one church, or as big as your city? Because if a vision is as big, it's just as big as one church. Getting a new church started is a great thing. It's a very tough, a very difficult challenge. But that's a really good thing to do. But in most cities, most contexts, getting one new church started is not going to put a dent in the lostness. We have to think multiplication. We have to think about how we want to plant several churches over the next years and lead those churches to plant more and those to plant more so we can truly go from a vision to a movement. So as you have a vision for your city, you start to think it's going to take more than just our church to do this, more than just our one new church to do this. So, for instance, for us going to Calgary, our vision statement and our perspective is very, very simple. Is we want to saturate Calgary with the gospel of Christ. So saturation means every nook and cranny, every person from every place in the city of Calgary will have daily opportunity. Every man, woman, and child will have daily opportunities to be part of God's family because we are sharing the gospel. We're inviting them to our lives, inviting them to the life of our church, and we want to see the city saturated. And we're going to do that by multiplying disciples, leaders, and churches. And so we have a citywide vision, but we got to start somewhere. We have to start with at least getting that one church started and then collaborating with other churches to get even more churches started. If you've had the first class that's in this program, it's a class on disciple making, very, very simple and straightforward. And it's in that class that we actually look at the lostness numbers across North America, the U.S. and Canada, where we have many of our major cities, such as Portland, Seattle, New York, Philadelphia, and then Canada, Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver, Montreal. Many of our cities are 85, 90, 95, even 99% unevangelical, unchurched, far from God. And so I'm not sure the context you come from. Your area may not have quite as high of a percentage, but there's still lost people around. There's a need for new churches in every single community because we have to work together. And no one church is going to reach every single person. That's just the reality. And so instead of a competition, we collaborate. We work together for the sake of our city, and we help multiply churches. And that's how we want to push back lostness and how we want to see lives changed by the gospel. Um, so let's kind of work through each of the phases here and just kind of get it. This is almost like an outline for the course, if you want to see it that way. Because we're going to be discussing all these bullet points at the bottom is the rest of the course. We'll be looking at several of these topics and ideas as we progress through. But in the envisioning phase, the big three that you'll be doing in the envisioning phase, praying, exploring, and discerning. Okay, praying about where, when, and how. Praying that you have a God-sized vision for more than just getting one new church started. You're praying that you can understand the Great Commission and live it out now before you go. Exploring, okay, what is God calling me to do? Have I been assessed for this? Is He calling me to plant a church, to revitalize an existing church that is struggling and on the verge of dying, or maybe replant a church, merge with another church? I mean, there's different ways to foster church multiplication. So in this class, some of you've already filled out the form and you've noticed some of you are wanting to be a lead church planter and help start a new church. Some of you are in a church already and you just simply, or you're taking this course because you simply want your church to just be more involved in church planting. You want your church to just in some way help start new churches in areas that need it. Some of you actually are a little more wired in your personality, your spiritual gifting and other things to actually lead a new church, an existing church, to revitalization, to get them from a declining years of decline and stop that, fix things, get things going, and retool some stuff, and then get onto a growth track so that you can multiply and have a greater impact. So that would be something. And the reality is these phases are not just for church planting in particular. You can apply these phases for starting any new ministry, starting a new Sunday school class, starting a new youth group, starting a new park ministry with your high school students. There was one former student who took this particular course the very first time I taught it, and we had coffee just 2 weeks ago, and we were in downtown Winston, and he is a worship pastor at his church, and they want to engage one of our local university campuses, and so I just encourage him to think back through these phases and develop a plan. How are we envisioning this? Are we praying about what God wants to do on this campus? Are we exploring the opportunities and what's going on there? Are we discerning what is best? Then through the preparing phase, phase, and then you're going to launch to get some kind of new ministry started, or the first day that we partner with this Christian group on campus, and then you're going to establish what it is, and then multiply your efforts. And so no matter what kind of ministry you're doing, you can follow these phases, whether it's planting a church, revitalizing a church, or even replanting. I think these phases and the questions you'll be asking or will be answering on the prospectus research document are very applicable to many different kinds of ministry settings. If you are in the North American Church Planting minor, you will do a practicum, an internship, part of your local church, or you'll do it with a church planter. But one of the options is actually you start a new ministry of some sort, and you do work through these phases over the course of a semester to get a new ministry started. And for instance, one of the former students who's already graduated, he actually helped his church start a new Sunday school class for single moms, because that was a need. They did not have a class for that. And so he himself was a Sunday school teacher. He was not on staff for the church, but he worked with their discipleship pastor. He worked through the phases, and they envisioned what they needed. They needed a Sunday school class for single moms. And so what that looked like, they started to explore, who would be teaching it. Then they started preparing. They found a teacher. They started to designing a curriculum. They started advertising this new class and building interest. And then they started. And so over the course of his practicum over 4 months, they got to that point. They were able to start toward the end of his time, and that was a great way that he did his internship for the program minor. And to my knowledge, that class is still going. I don't know if it has multiplied. I hope it has. That was a year and a half ago. So anyways, I just want to say that these phases, and that what you'll see, each phase is really applicable to starting any kind of new ministry. That's why I took the examples of the others and just brought them down into a little more general terms, so it can be more applicable across the board. So in here, you're praying, exploring, discerning, and you're really asking the key questions of where is God leading me to plant? Is it here I'm already living, or a new place? When? Is now the right time, or is a future date? And then why am I doing this? We often don't ask the why question in church planting. So why am I doing this? What is my motive? And my motive years ago as a young undergrad was I wanted to have the cool church in town. Horrible motive for wanting to plant a church. That is no longer my motive. Is to push back lostness and see more people come to Christ. Prepare. Sorry, I forgot to fix that little prepare word up there, but I guess you can still read it. My screen adjusted a little bit when I was editing the slides. But anyways, in the preparing phase, you're researching, you're partnering, and you're entering. Okay, the research part, creating a vision framework and prospectus. We'll talk about those as two kind of key documents to really help you organize what it is you're going to do. You're selecting and exegeting the context. And the context is basically the area, the community, the city. You want to select it. It may be the one you're already living in, maybe very close by, or maybe like us, it's 2,700 miles away in another country. But you also want to exegete the context. You want to start examining and getting to know it and understand that area even before you move. You want to start doing some research and understand the demographics and size of the community and the different needs and different things. In preparing phase, you want to think through what is the best church planting model or approach that fits the context. And part of this is also doing vision trips. That can happen in the envisioning phase, but it can happen as well in the early phase of the preparing, where you're taking trips to this new area just to see what is needed here, so you can start preparing for that. You're also developing partners for prayer, finances, and recruiting a team. And so this is a really, really big thing. The last 7 months, as we have been in the envisioning and going into the preparing phase, we have been doing partnership development where we had to raise our own support. So we had to raise money in order for some initial one-time cost and for our monthly living expenses until we can get a new church established that can become self-supporting. And so we've been developing partners to pray for us. We've asked partners to consider praying, coming, and giving. We look for 1,000 individuals who will pray, 100 small groups who will just pray for us regularly. And they sign up for our email newsletter, and they have the prayer points each week that come to them. Right now, the prayer points are: we're 2 weeks away from moving, and we're packing, and things are a little chaotic in the house right now, and I'm traveling almost every other day, finishing up our development and fundraising, different things. And so it's just been a little crazy. That's part of the preparing phase and what we've been doing. You're also recruiting a team. Some church planners are able to recruit teams of 25, 30, 30, even 40 people who may, some of them even move to a new city with them, get jobs and so forth, and become part of the launch team, the core group of this new church as they are building relationships and things. Or for myself, since we are moving to another country, moving to Canada, you can't just walk across the border and expect to find a job. You have to have some type of visa. And so for us, our team is very, very small. It is me, my wife, my 19-month-old son Kirk, and our dog, and a grad student named Beth who is moving from our church, and she is going under a student visa. I'll have a religious workers visa. She'll have a student visa. But other than that, that's our team right now. We have another young man who is considering going. I just called him young man. I sound like an old guy. Anyways, he's only a couple years younger than myself, but a good buddy. He's actually as a student in this class. I won't name him, but he is working towards trying to come up as well with us and join our team a little bit later after we get there. So our team is very, very small because we are crossing into another country. It's a little bit tough to have a team, but we're going to be developing a team once we get there. A lot of people are going to be, I've joked often that our core group, our launch team, they are in Calgary right now doing something else on a Sunday morning with their time. And they don't know that in just a few months, just a year or so, they're going to be helping lead and start a new church. I think it's going to be exciting. And then you're also going to be entering the community and implementing a disciple-making strategy and culture, a disciple-making culture for your church. So for us, we have to move and rent a new house in North Calgary, and so we'll be doing that here soon. And so some of you may be planting in your hometown or revitalizing a church in your hometown, and you don't have to move, but you have to enter the community in some way and start building those relationships. The launch phase. Here is where you're organizing, delegating, and starting, okay? So you're developing and multiplying your small groups. You're organizing the church governance. You can be elder-led, congregational-led, different forms of that, and we'll discuss that in a lecture. And you're legal. You're going to be a 501c3, tax status, all those type of things, constitution, bylaws. We'll have a lecture discussing those things, and even the financial structure. Who's going to organize the finances? Are you going to have a team? Are you going to hire an accountant? How are you going to do that? So those are some things to discuss as well. But this is in the launch phase. It's like a pre-launch time, and then there's a time where things get started, the first Sunday gathering, for instance. And so in that pre-launch time, you're getting all these things ready for your first public worship service. But you haven't stopped evangelizing. You haven't stopped a lot of the preparing things. You haven't stopped building relationships in the community with leaders and discipling new believers. You're still doing those things, but you're also getting ready to, okay, we have something to get started. So you're going to choose a name. If you're going to design a logo for your church for some branding purposes, securing a meeting location, in your perspectives, you'll be doing this. You actually will design a logo for your church plant. You're going to have fun with it. Be creative. You want to choose a name for it. And you're going to be picking a location, and you're going to get on the phone. If it's not happen to be your city, you're going to get on the phone. You're going to call places, community centers, schools, movie theaters. You're going to find somewhere to meet. Now, this is going to be, you want to tell them this is for a class project. I'm not actually looking for this, but what would be the rent per month and what would be the lease agreement, those type of things. You need to ask those questions because many churches now, for church planning now, really is very, very few have a building. So the strategy really is becoming a mobile church initially. Hopefully you'll have a building one day if God leads you, and that's part of your strategy. But really starting off, you're meeting somewhere else, a school auditorium, a gymnasium somewhere, a YMCA, a movie theater, all kind of different options until you, if God blesses, your church grows and is able to build or purchase a building. Great, do it. You can use that community use that church building for the community. I think that'd be great, but most church plants do not start with a building unless it's a replant or some type of merger, which is another strategy as well. In this time, you're going to be delegating roles of leaders. You're going to be equipping them. You're going to be, okay, who are going to be maybe some of our pastors and deacons and different things. You're delegating those roles and figuring out and who's going to do the parking if we need that. Who's going to run the kids ministry? Do you need to hire for this? All these type of things go in to this launch and pre-launch phase. Then you're going to start something. You're going to have day one of a public worship service. And like I said earlier, if you're a house church, that's going to look very different. But still, there is a time where you do get started. All right. And almost done. The established phase, you're establishing your rhythm, your relationships, and your roles. Okay, so the rhythm, worship, preaching. Are you going to have Sunday morning? What time Sunday morning is it going to be? A Sunday night? Is that the best time? Because you're renting out another church. You're using another church's sanctuary, so you meet on Sunday night when because they're meeting Sunday morning. You're developing that rhythm. You're developing a preaching rhythm. Are you the only one preaching, or are the other maybe some other leaders are on your launch team are going to be sharing a preaching role? You're going to be figuring out that kind of rhythm. Was your rhythm for small groups, for the scattering part of church, and how you do mission projects and serving and those type of things? So what does that rhythm look like? What's your small group rhythm going to be? So these are the things that you're just establishing because you're a new church with a bunch of a diverse group of people that God has brought together to start and lead and be part of this new church. And so you're establishing these things. You're establishing systems. You're establishing programs for children and youth, if that is applicable, which most time it is. You're establishing community relationships and partnerships. You're getting to know other local businesses, or if you're renting some kind of storefront space, you're building a relationship with a business next door so that you're friendly and you're there for them and can serve them as well. You're getting to know the government, civic leaders of that community. You're getting to know the school board. You're getting to know the community center directors and the HOA, all these type of things. You're getting to know them because you're establishing yourself as we are here in the community and we are for the community. Okay. You're also establishing not just relationships outside the church, but even inside the church, and then that progresses into deciding on roles. In your launch phase, some people might be doing several different things because things are new, and we got to have one guy's doing audio visual, and he's doing door greeting, and he's also doing administrative stuff during the week. But as your church becomes established, you're raising up other people to take over ministries and really finding out what are people's spiritual gifts. Where is the best place for them to use those gifts? And you also are developing a plan for how you're going to develop new leaders. We call it a leadership pipeline or leadership pathway. How you're going to get them going from they're a very, very young new believer, just been saved, new in their discipleship, to one day they are progressing through and they are a pastor that you are sending out to plant a new church, or they take your spot. You've planted, you've raised this person up, and they take your spot. And then you look at the role for yourself, transitioning from the planter to the pastor to a catalyst. What does that look like? Because when you're a planter, you're doing a lot of things. Over the next year, I'll be doing very little preaching because we'll be apprenticing and joining a local church to kind of plant out of, but I'm not going to be one of their pastors and not be preaching on a regular basis. I'll do it some, but on a regular basis. But once I do become a pastor, that will become a regular thing. And so there's a role transition even for yourself as you progress through these phases. And we'll discuss what it looks like after you're in the envisioning, preparing in the launching phase. Then the establishing phase, your role changes usually from the planter to the pastor, but you don't want to forget that as a planter, you are sharing the gospel, building relationships, and helping this new church grow. You don't ever forget that. You don't stop being a planter per se, but the role changes. Not who you are. And then maybe you become a catalyst. You become a trainer for other pastors and other leaders, and able to help really see that vision go from a vision to a movement. And then the repeat. Here you're envisioning, you're preparing, and you're sending. Okay, so you're envisioning, okay, what's our church? Where should our church be multiplying other new congregations? How are we going to prepare for that? How are we going to become a multiplying church? How are we going to reproduce leaders and worship leaders, artists? How are we going to reproduce small groups? What does that look like? How are we going to reproduce maybe sites? Maybe a multi-campus strategy is the best for your church at some point. Or you're going to reproduce new churches. Many churches do a both and approach. How are you going to reproduce networks and movements? How are you going to replicate what you've done as you've gotten a network of a couple dozen churches in your city that you have? So how are you going to help that happen a city 2 or 3 hours away? And so how are you going to help shape what that looks like and send people for that? And then how are you going to send your best people? How are you going to send that co-pastor or that youth pastor or something that's just really great and everyone loves them, but they need to be out and pastor a new congregation? How are you going to be willing and able to send your best? So here are just some kind of core ideas. You'll hear a lot of these talk about just in the class, having this whole you go through the phase and almost get stuck in this the kind of methodical. We have to envision, prepare, launch, establish, da da da. Da. But really, the whole time, as you're doing this, you're doing this hopefully in a Christ-centered way. You're saturating in prayer and in love. You're being humbled and showing a lot of humility because things are not going always as you plan. You're figuring things out. You're always evaluating what God is doing. Does this ministry work? Does this program work? How should we need to change up Sunday morning worship time or whatever it is? You're always evaluating. You're always dependent on the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is driving the church. We see that in the Book of Acts. You'll see that as you journal. Are we always being focused on disciple making? Did we only make disciples to get a new church started and then we stop? We're always doing that. And we're basing everything we do in Scripture. We're preaching and teaching. And as Matthew 28 says, teaching them to obey, especially based from Scripture. How you caring for people? Are you sacrificially giving and serving? Are you being flexible when things change and don't really quite go your way? And are we practicing one another's as a local body, the love one another's, be kind to one another's that we see in Scripture? Are we practicing those? So all of those go into kind of building a mindset and a heart and passion undergirding what we're doing as far as the phases. Don't see the phases as just a methodical, it's just a plan on paper, but in each of these phases, you're watching God do some amazing things, and I'm excited even as we have gone through this Envision, we're in the preparing phase as a family now. Just what God has done along this journey. It hasn't just become a timeline. It's become a really fun experience, and so just got to keep that in mind. And there's three foundations that I kind of want to conclude with. And they're the three multis that you'll hear a lot in the class. The first one is multiplication. You see that the thing is built around repeating. You saw that in all the phases and models that we looked at the beginning. They all have something to do with multiplication or reproduction. And so everything you do, how are we going to, you're developing a new service team for, getting coffee things ready. Well, how are you going to think how that can multiply when you need to do a lot more coffee? You're expanding things. I mean, something that simple. But how are you embedding a foundation of multiplication into the minds of your people, of your leaders, and of your vision and your strategy? Is it going to be multi-ethnic? Now, this is a kind of a hot issue right now because, especially in the U.S., we do not have a lot of truly multi-ethnic congregations. There's going to be a supplemental video posted between our own Professor Matt Smith and Pastor Duran Gray, who you may know him as the evangelism linebacker. Yes, look that up on YouTube, evangelism linebacker. Duran Gray is now pastor of Transformation Church just south of Charlotte, former Carolina Panther football player. And he has one of the fastest growing, truly multi-ethnic church. He's an African American, and he's got a mix of nationalities and ethnicities represented in his church. And it's a beautiful thing. I got to spend some time with him when we were recording a video a couple years ago, and just to hear his heart for it, and something you have to really work for, but it's not something that's really being done. But the reality is your church is going to really mirror your community. If you're in a community that's predominantly something, whatever ethnicity it is, it's not a sin for your church to mirror the community. But I think it is a sin that you only go after that one demographic or that one ethnicity to the neglect of others. One of our core values for our church plant in Calgary is that everyone is welcome to be part of God's family. No matter your age, your vocation, your socioeconomic income, the color of your skin, the language you speak, that does not matter because in Revelation 5, it's people from every nation, tribe, and tongue and language. So a foundation of being multi-ethnic as well, both in your outreach and in your inreach. And then the last one is multifaceted. The reality is church planting is being done differently in different places because each context demands its own unique approach. It demands its own kind of unique skill set from the church planter himself. And so church planting is very multifaceted. There's a lot of things happening, a lot of different things going on. But this really, church planting lets you be innovative. It lets you think outside the box. It lets you experiment. But it also lets you evaluate and assess and readjust when things aren't quite going your way or going well for the church. So church planting is a very multifaceted ministry. You're doing a lot of things, especially as the role of planter. You'll be doing many, many things, and there always will be changing. So those are three multis for our foundations.